So on July 22nd, 2021, Biogen came out with an announcement regarding their recently FDA approved Alzheimer's drug Aducanumab, which is also known as Aduhelm. In this statement, they basically talk about the recent controversy surrounding the FDA approval and why they believe that it has been subject to extensive misinformation and misunderstanding, and they don't think so. So, what is aducanumab? Just to give you a very brief understanding, it's an immunobiologic therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease. A lot of people are excited about this announcement, given that it's the first Alzheimer's disease therapy to be approved in the last 20, in nearly 20 years, and one that targets more of the basic biology rather than targeting symptomatics. So, however, there is some contention around this, and it's been an interesting journey to say the least. I don't know what you think, RK.
Yeah, no, let's, start from scratch, right? What's the biology of it, right? And what is the biology of Alzheimer's disease,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what we know about Alzheimer's, and, what happens to a person with Alzheimer's disease, right? Is that there are these plaques that build up in the brain, and then there are these tangles that build up in the brain. So there's plaques and there's tangles, right? And these plaques are caused by this protein called the amyloid beta protein. And, we have this, everyone has this protein, right? And it's just that as people get older, some people have larger concentrations of it. Now, those concentrations and that concentration ends up being, aggregates in the brain. And those aggregates aren't easy to flush out for various reasons, including the blood-brain barrier and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one big, symptom, really. It's a clinical sort of symptom that is noticed in people with Alzheimer's disease. The other one is the neurofibrillary tangles, the tangles. It's a similar idea with a different protein, the tau protein. We won't be talking a whole lot about it, but suffice to say that there's another symptom that can be observed with MRIs and so on. It turns out that aducanumab is one of a few molecules. So MABs, right? So they're monoclonal antibodies. They're protein themselves. They're antibodies, right? So they're Y-shaped objects that are proteins. They bind, right? That's what antibodies do. They bind, right? So this aducanumab, Biogen's drug, Aduhelm, it binds to the amyloid beta protein. This is known, at least in mouse models, it is known. And it is shown to reduce plaques by binding to both soluble and insoluble amyloid beta protein. This is itself a fairly significant achievement scientifically because, these monoclonal antibodies, they have to cross the blood-brain barrier, and they have to bind very specifically to that protein and not to others. And they have to bind at a certain kinetics, otherwise it won't work. So all of these elements conspire to make it very hard for, for the right protein to be found that can actually do all of those things. So in that way, it is, a bit of an achievement. But, the tricky part in all of this is whether amyloid plaques actually cause Alzheimer's. Or the other tangles, are they the cause of Alzheimer's, or are they a symptom, but Alzheimer's is really caused by a complex of other things that we don't really know about? And there's, research that says for, and there's research that says against. And so we'll attach some citations to this video that shows both of those things. But because this is somewhat unknown, this sort of introduces the first element of, let's say, doubt into this entire process, whether actually treating amyloid plaques is going to make the disease go away or not, right? So that's really sort of the big picture.
I see. Yeah, I mean, like you're saying, that is a very valid concern. Are you actually treating a cause, or are you treating a symptom?
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, the Alzheimer's Association came out. I think it's yeah. So also Alzheimer's Association, sorry, came out in very big support for aducanumab.
Yeah.
So what they are saying, and very rightly so, that is This is the first drug to be approved in 20 years. In nearly 20 years, this is the first Alzheimer's drug that has been approved. Treatment that's currently carrying on are from other drugs. And the second point is that other FDA approved drugs are for symptomatic treatment, right?
Right.
So while, like you just mentioned,
Yes.
we don't know whether the amyloid plaques are symptomatic or not.
Yes.
Everything else does, at least this is treating something which is part of the underlying biology of Alzheimer's. None of the other drugs do that at the moment.
Yes.
And the third thing that they have mentioned, and maybe you can explain a little more, RK, is looking at the clinical study evidence. But there has been evidence of reduction in clinical decline, especially in the mouse models. So in those mouse models, those phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials, when the mouse models were given aducanumab, they did see that there was reduction of those plaques and a reduction in cognitive decline. Now, in the human studies, it's a little bit more, it's a little harder to discern. And maybe, Aki, you can just explain what those studies showed and where the contention or where the worry came from those clinical trials.
Yeah, and we talked about efficacy, right? And we talked about efficacy in the COVID vaccine situation, right? In general, these are all statistical studies, and you have two arms, right? And one arm is administered a placebo, which is in all respects resembles the drug, but does not contain any active ingredient, and the other arm is administered the drug, right? And you track both of those people, and they have exactly the same symptoms. They both have Alzheimer's in this case, right? And certain specifications of Alzheimer's, they're probably a little more on the early stage and so on, right? And you track them over time, and you basically see how the placebo arm responds versus how the treatment arm responds. And if your drug's doing well, that your treatment arm clearly stands out, and people are doing much better there, but the placebo arm does not, right? So that's the sort of background, right? And within this background, if you measure what they call an endpoint, which is basically one way to measure whether someone is doing well, right? So there's a dementia score. It's called, I think, CDR, if I'm not mistaken. It's a clinical score based on apparent symptoms. Really, it's not sort of. It's more of what they'd say a phenotype that's apparent, rather than something that's more intrinsic, that's measured, right? So they just ask the patient a series of questions and so on, and that leads to a dementia rating, right? So that's the clinical dementia rate. I think that's what it's called, CDR, right? So based on the CDR endpoint, the efficacy appears to be 23%, right? Which basically means that you are 23% more likely to improve if you were administered aducanumab than if you were not, if you of course conform to all the inclusion criteria in the trial, right? This is actually pretty significant, right? So let's just sort of take a step back. Why is this significant? Because there is nothing that is even close to 23% efficacy right now. Nobody really knows what to do with Alzheimer's right now, right? So 23% is very significant, right? However, here's the but, right? So only one of the two trials actually showed these results.
I see.
And so there were two trials. Actually, I think there were three, but or at least there's three listed on clinical trials. But the ones we're talking about are the Emerge and the Evolve trial. And they were both essentially identical trials. Only one of them showed results. The other thing too was everything was based on more of a retrospective or a post hoc analysis. And from a statistical perspective, when you're doing a post hoc analysis, slightly different rules of statistical analysis apply. And if you were to actually apply those rules, the efficacy dramatically decreases, the actual efficacy, right? So it's unclear right now. I mean, at best, it's unclear whether this has an efficacy. What is known is, of course, that it works to reduce plaques in mouse models. But beyond that, for instance, many things are still somewhat unknown. How is it? So how are these amyloid plaques excreted, right? So if you actually Google that, it's not easy to find out. And it appears as though that is also not well known. And that's an important part of this, because you need to show that those amyloid plaques are being eliminate
Removed from the
the
body.
body
Yeah.
from the body in some way, if you're going to say that, hey, I'm reducing it, so where did it go, right? How did it leave the body, right? So these are some legitimate questions that are still, I think, uh, need to be addressed, right? And given that they need to be addressed, um, there were significant concerns. There were two people on the FDA committee that
Three,
resigned.
actually.
Sorry.
Three of them, actually.
Oh, there were three of them, right?
Yeah.
So there were three of them that resigned after the approval came through, I think in April earlier this year, right? So it's definitely, at least it is a conversation. It is not emphatic. The evidence is not emphatic.
No, exactly. And I think this conversation about efficacy also raised some really interesting concerns about what it takes for a drug to be approved, and what
Yes.
is the line at which the FDA approves drugs. So
Yes.
there has been some concern that now that this drug has been approved, does that mean other pharma companies will maybe not invest in finding drugs that have much higher efficacies if they know they can target and treat drugs that have lower efficacies given the state of the situation. Now, the
Yeah.
Alzheimer's Association, interestingly, said the exact opposite, where they said, hey, look, we've had no drugs available for so long. And
Yeah.
by the FDA approving this first drug, what it's showing people and what it's signaling is that there is money in Alzheimer treatment. And so those are really the two sides of the coin when it comes to what that line is. I think the other thing that I've found really fascinating, and Aki, you and I have also had a few conversations about this, is surrounding a Vox article that came out sometime earlier in June, uh, titled, very clickbaity,
Yeah.
clickbaitily, the new Alzheimer's drug that could break Medicare.
Right.
Now, so just to give you a basic overview of this, the idea is that aducanumab is very expensive. At that time, Biogen was setting the list price at about $56,000 a year per patient,
Yeah.
which is a really, really steep price. And in countries like the United States, it'll be covered by Medicare and Medicaid because it is an FDA-approved drug, at least to some extent. And so some have argued that this could mean an increased burden on an already overtaxed system, especially given the uncertainty involved in its efficacy. Right. So when you have a drug, when you have a disease, sorry, which affects so many people, and you have a drug where you're not sure it will always solve the problem,
Yeah.
is it fair? And I'm not trying to question this, and I'm not trying to say yes it is fair or no it isn't fair. I think I'm just trying to raise the point that it's difficult to make the decision of whether it's fair to approve such a drug, or who should get the drug versus who should not get the drug when they're so expensive.
Yeah.
I think one way of looking at this is, a few years ago, I want to say 2015, 2016, there was a drug that came out by Novartis called Zolgensma, and it is still currently touted as the most expensive drug in the world.
Yeah.
I think it's about 2.1 million US at the moment, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, that's
Um,
correct.
and that's crazy.
Yeah.
So Zolgensma is a gene therapy, however. So Zolgensma, the way it's a therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, a debilitating disease which you get at birth, and most patients unfortunately die within a year or two. Less severe patients, less severe, sorry, types of the disease, you get to live till the age of 20, but it is not an easy disease to live with, and it is a genetic disease, right? And Zolgensma, that way, was a breakthrough revolutionary disease. It was a gene therapy. It's a single dose. The patient gets a single dose, I think, within a year or two of birth,
Yeah.
and they're able to live much longer lives with a much better, sorry, what do you call it? Living, just they have a much better
Quality of life,
quality
perhaps.
of life. Exactly. Thank you. And so in that case, there was, I mean, this same debate came up, right? Is it fair for it to be an FDA approved drug? Is it fair for healthcare systems to pay for it versus should an individual pay for it? But how is it possible for an individual to pay for it when it's so expensive? And I think what's really interesting in these two different case studies is, in the situation of Zolgensma,
Yeah.
SMA or spinal muscular atrophy affects a lot fewer cases a year. There's very, very few cases of it a year. So that does mean there are fewer patients. And you know that you have maybe not 100% efficacy, but a much higher efficacy.
Yeah.
Right? Versus in this case of aducanumab, while it is a cheaper drug relatively, you have a lot more patients
Yeah.
and you don't know how high the efficacy is. And so I mean, I don't have any answers, and I don't know what the right I don't know what the right thing to do in this situation is. I think this really highlights how difficult the drug discovery and the drug and just understanding drug treatment is, and paying for drug treatment can be in the current situation.
Absolutely. And if I were just to add to this, I would just say that the challenges before us as a society are to exactly walk this line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I read this article. I don't know if it was the Vox article, but it was certainly one of these articles where they said, look, if it's a cure for Alzheimer's, we'll find a way as a society to pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But this is not that.
Yeah.
So where do we draw that line? Do we say that we want, we want pharma companies, we want the people with the minds and the money to invest, and so we're going to approve this, but we're going to keep a good watch? Or are we going to say, nice try, right? um, and I think there are arguments, as we've seen today, for both.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's an interesting problem to have, and maybe while not an easy problem to have,
Yeah,
hopefully it's a problem that becomes easier and easier to solve, and maybe crops up more in the sense that the
yeah,
more drugs we have and the more conversations we can have like this,
exactly.
and from that lens, I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah, I want to end with a story. My grandmother's sister, the person I have known for a while, not very closely, but I have known her, has both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Um, it is a wasting disease.
Mhm.
Alzheimer's, essentially your mind wastes away while your body is more or less healthy. That is the tragedy of Alzheimer's. And the reason it's so compelling as a disease is a lot of us see what we may be if we are completely deprived of our mental faculties and are given an arbitrary long period of time in which to progressively decline mentally. And it is, we discuss cancer a lot, but I think it is a terrifying disease. And as you said, having conversations about it is really going to eventually spark research and eventually help solve, hopefully, these are the hardest problems of our time.
Okay. I think on that note, we can maybe end. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.